Hi everyone, welcome back to the Anna-losophy Podcast. This video will probably be uploaded a bit after it was filmed, but over the past few weeks, I've unexpectedly found myself falling into the world of art. I began visiting galleries and museums with friends and family because I thought it would be a very fun way to spend an afternoon. At first, I appreciated the colors, the scale, and the creativity behind each piece, but I didn't think much beyond that. I treated art the way I think many people do, as something enjoyable to look at, something that fills a gallery wall or brightens a museum, but ultimately something separate from the kinds of philosophical questions we've been exploring on this podcast. But this completely changed after I visited an exhibition by Damien Hirst. Before going, I already heard of him because of some of his most famous works, especially the enormous shark suspended in a glass tank, which is an image that has become almost impossible to separate from contemporary art itself. And I expected to see a lot of controversial works that challenge traditional ideas about what art could be. What I didn't expect was to leave thinking less about the artworks themselves and more about the philosophical ideas behind them. As I walked throughout the entire exhibition, I realized that every room seemed to be asking the same question from a different perspective. It wasn't simply about death, medicine, or science. It was really about what it means to be human when we know that our lives are finite and death is approaching us. And for the first time, I began seeing art as a way of doing philosophy. So today, I'd like to share that experience with you. I'll begin by introducing Damien Hirst himself and the story behind one of the most influential contemporary artists of the last 40 years. And then I'd like to look closely at several of the works that left the strongest impression on me, but also the general public, including the shark, the spinning paintings, his medicine cabinets, etc. Exploring not only what they are, but why Hirst created them and why they changed the way people thought about contemporary art. And I'd like to step back from the individual artworks and ask the broader philosophical question that I found myself thinking about after I left the museum. Why has Damien Hirst spent his entire career returning to that subject of death? And what can that obsession teach us about the way we choose to live? Before talking about the artworks themselves, I think it's important to understand the person who created them. Damien Hirst was born in 1965 in Bristol, England, and grew up in the city of Leeds after his parents separated when he was still young. He has often described himself as a rebellious teenager who was frequently in trouble at school and struggled with authority. Yet throughout those years, there was one fascination that kept returning: death. As a teenager, Hirst was drawn towards medical imagery and anatomy. He has spoken about visiting the anatomy department at Leeds Medical School to sketch preserved bodies. Rather than seeing those specimens as intimidating, scary, or even horrifying, he became fascinated by the strange contradiction they represented. A preserved body still occupies space, resembles a human being, and appears physically present, but the life that once animated it has completely disappeared. This distinction stayed with him for decades, and eventually became the foundation of almost everything he would create. Long before he ever placed a shark in said glass tank or filled a room with medicine cabinets, he had already become interested in a philosophical question. Why is it so difficult for us to understand death when we know it's the one experience everyone will eventually share? In 1986, Hirst enrolled at Goldsmiths College in London, one of Britain's most experimental art schools. The timing couldn't have been better. During the late 1980s, contemporary art in Britain was beginning to change. Traditional painting and sculpture were no longer the only ways artists expressed ideas. Installations, conceptual art, and unconventional materials were becoming increasingly popular and common, and Goldsmiths encouraged students to think beyond technical skill alone. So, many artists were beginning to ask whether art was intellectually challenging. Could an artwork function like a philosophical argument? Could an object provoke ideas that words sometimes struggle to express? Hirst really liked and embraced that approach. He became interested in creating experiences that made viewers confront uncomfortable questions. While he was still a student, Hirst organized an exhibition that would completely change the direction of his life, as well as art. In 1988, he curated an exhibition called Freeze inside an abandoned warehouse in London's Docklands. The exhibition featured work by fellow Goldsmiths students. It attracted critics, collectors, and influential figures from across the British art world. Looking back today, Freeze is often described as the moment the young British artists, known as the YBAs, first emerged. This was a generation of artists who challenged almost every assumption people had about art. They created works that sparked debate across newspapers, television, museums, and much more. Hirst became its most recognizable figure. One of the people who visited Frieze was the advertising entrepreneur and collector Charles Saatchi. Saatchi immediately recognized something unusual and special in Hirst's work and became one of his earliest supporters. This relationship changed Hirst's career almost overnight because it gave him the financial freedom to produce works on a scale that very few young artists had access to. Many of the installations that later made him internationally famous would have been nearly impossible without the support. More importantly, it allowed Hirst to pursue ideas that were very ambitious. By the beginning of the 1990s, Damien Hirst had become one of the most talked about artists in Britain. Newspapers described him as controversial. Critics argued endlessly about whether his work should be considered art. Some praised him as one of the most original artists of his generation, but others believed that his exhibitions were a form of elaborate publicity. What I find interesting, though, is that these debates have never really disappeared. More than 30 years later, you would still find people disagreeing about Damien Hirst, and perhaps that's one of the clearest signs that his work continues to matter, the fact that his work continues to influence us today. As I walked through the exhibition, I realized that every gallery seemed connected by the same underlying idea. Different materials appeared in different rooms, and sometimes I found myself standing before preserved animals. Sometimes I was surrounded by medicine cabinets or colorful paintings. And at first, those works didn't seem as connected, but the longer I spent there, the more they began to feel like different chapters of the same journey or story. Hirst was returning to the same subject because he believed it revealed something important about being human. Everyone knows they will eventually die, but almost nobody truly understands what that knowledge means. Science can describe death biologically, and medicine can delay it. Religion can interpret it, and philosophy can debate it. Art, however, can place us face to face with the emotional reality of mortality. And this was probably the biggest surprise for me. Before visiting the exhibition, I thought of philosophy and art as two very separate worlds. Philosophy asked questions through arguments. Art communicated through images and objects, so I thought there wasn't really any interconnectedness between them. Walking through Damien Hirst's exhibition, though, challenged my assumption. I began to realize that his artworks were ideas made physical. Every installation invited me to truly think on top of observing. Instead of offering answers, they encouraged me and the audience to remain with difficult questions that many of us spend our lives trying not to ask. With that context established, let's move on to the pieces that truly stands out, not just to me, but to a broader audience. The first work I want to talk about is probably Damien Hirst's most famous, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, created in 1991. Before I visited the exhibition, this was the artwork I already associated with Hirst. Even people who have never stepped inside an art museum have probably seen a photograph of it somewhere. A 14-foot tiger shark is suspended inside a large glass vitrine filled with formaldehyde, giving the impression that it's still swimming towards the viewer. When Charles Saatchi commissioned the work in 1991, it immediately became one of the most defining images of contemporary art. Standing in front of it, though, I have to say, was really different from seeing photographs online. Although photographs capture the shark, they can't really capture the feeling of sharing the same space with it or being near it. The scale is pretty overwhelming, and to me, quite a bit scary. The glass is so clear that the barrier almost disappears, which leaves you with this impression that the enormous predator is still moving through the water. For a brief moment, your instincts almost forget that the animal is dead. Then, almost immediately afterwards, you remember exactly what you're looking at. And that constant tension between life and death stayed with me throughout the entire time I stood there. The shark looks astonishingly alive, yet every part of the work exists because life has already ended. And Hirst deliberately preserves that contradiction. The title fascinated me so much as well. The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living is an unusually long title, but I think every word is important. Hirst is making a philosophical observation about consciousness. As living beings, we can understand death intellectually. We know that every person who has ever lived has eventually died. History teaches us that, and science explains it, and medicine studies it. But despite understanding those facts, there remains a strange distance between knowing that death exists and imagining our own non-existence. Every attempt to imagine our own death begins from the perspective of someone who is still alive. The mind trying to imagine its own absence is, by definition, still present. When Hirst later reflected on the work, he explained that he wanted to create something that confronted people with death directly instead of allowing it to remain an abstract idea. I think this reflects the world in which he grew up. During the 20th century, especially after advances in modern medicine, death gradually became something most people encountered less frequently in everyday life. It moved into hospitals, care homes, and funeral homes, becoming increasingly separated from ordinary experience. We all know death exists, but we don't really spend much time looking directly at it. In fact, we don't really want to. Hirst doesn't want this though. He doesn't allow death to remain a philosophical concept discussed only in theoretics or in books. He places it directly in front of us, which is large enough that ignoring it becomes impossible. The shark itself is also a fascinating choice. Hirst could have preserved almost any animal, but he deliberately chose one that already occupies a unique place in the human imagination. Sharks have symbolized danger for quite a long time. They appeared throughout mythology, literature, and popular culture, even now, as creatures that inspire fear because they seem unstoppable. When we think of predators, the shark is usually one of the first images that come to mind. There are even songs about it, and Hirst understood that symbolism. He selected an animal that many people instinctively associated with power, violence, and survival. Then he presented it completely motionless. The creature we imagine is unstoppable has itself become vulnerable to death. Even one of nature's most formidable and strongest predators ever can't escape the same fate as every living organism. So this removes the illusion that mortality belongs only to the weak or the vulnerable or the fragile. Everyone is vulnerable in their own way. As I continued looking at the work, I stopped thinking about the animal and started thinking about everyone around me, as in the people looking at it, and myself. The artwork doesn't tell us how to feel, because it doesn't explain what death means or argue for a particular philosophical position. Instead, it creates a situation in which the viewer becomes part of the artwork. Everyone who stands before that glass brings their own fears, experiences, and beliefs into the room. For example, someone with strong religious beliefs might interpret it differently from someone approaching it from a purely scientific perspective, or someone recently lost a loved one might respond very differently from someone encountering the work for the first time. The real subject is the living person standing in front of it. The second work that completely captured my attention was 1,000 Years, created in 1990, and this was just 1 year before the physical impossibility of death in the mind of someone living. Although the shark has become Damien Hirst's most recognizable artwork, many critics and art historians have argued that 1,000 Years is actually one of his greatest achievements, because it introduces almost every philosophical idea that would define the rest of his career. Standing in front of it, I could definitely understand why. It's sort of different from the shark in that it doesn't rely on one object. Instead, it presents an entire cycle of life unfolding before your eyes. The installation, as you can see here, consists of a large glass vitrine divided into different sections. Inside are maggots, flies, a severed cow's head resting on the floor, a sugar solution that feeds the insects, and an insecto cutter that electrocutes them as they fly towards the light. Unlike most artworks, it's never completely still. Life is constantly emerging, transforming, and disappearing. In other words, the artwork changes while you stand there watching it, and that was really cool. What fascinated me, though, was Hirst's decision to use flies. Throughout history, flies have rarely been admired. Whether in literature, religion, and popular culture, they usually represent decay, disease, and death. Most of us instinctively try to avoid them. Hirst deliberately places those creatures at the center of the artwork because they force us to confront a part of nature that we normally ignore. The flies hatch from the maggots, feed, reproduce, move through the space for a short period of time, and eventually die after flying into the electric insect killer. New flies immediately replace them, and the entire cycle begins again. There is no clear beginning and no final ending. Birth and death become inseparable parts of the same continuous process. When I first looked at the installation, I found myself paying attention to individual flies. Then, after watching for several minutes, I realized that Hirst wasn't asking the audience to focus on any single insect. Every individual fly disappears almost as quickly as it appears, but the cycle itself continues uninterrupted. This completely changed the way I interpreted the work. The subject becomes life itself, no longer one living creature. Individual organisms come and go, but the process continues with indifference. That is, nature doesn't mourn what has disappeared because something new is already beginning, and that is the cycle of love. I think that's one of the reasons why this artwork is so philosophical. Western philosophy has often encouraged us to think about life and death as opposites, almost as though one just replaces the other. Hirst doesn't separate them, though. Throughout the installation, life continuously produces death. Death immediately creates the conditions for new life. The cow's head feeds the fleas reproduce before they die. Their bodies become part of the environment that supports the next generation, so nothing exists independently since every stage gives rise to the next. This idea has philosophical roots as well. More than 2,000 years ago, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus argued that reality is defined by constant change. Around 500 BC, he suggested that no person can step into the same river twice, because both the river and the person are continually changing. So Hirst's installation reminded me of that idea. Nothing inside 1,000 years remains exactly the same from one moment to another. New life appears and existing life disappears. The entire system transforms and changes without ever becoming fixed in one position. The artwork seems to suggest that change is what life has always been, not necessarily an interruption to life or something bad. I also couldn't help thinking about Charles Darwin while standing there. Where On the Origin of Species was published in 1959, Darwin challenged the idea that nature exists in a perfectly ordered balance. Instead, he described a world impacted by adaptation, reproduction, and survival across immense periods of time. So Hirst does present nature without sentimentality, although it doesn't illustrate Darwin's scientific theory directly. The installation never asks the viewer to decide whether the cycle is beautiful or cruel. It just exists, and life emerges because previous life has ended. The two can't be separated thus because each depends upon the other. The shark confronts us with one moment, but 1,000 years reminds us that mortality isn't a single event just waiting somewhere in the future. It's everywhere around us, and it's woven into every living system around us. Every animal, every human, every tree, and every flower exists within the same cycle. We often imagine death as the opposite of life, because that's how language encourages us to think. But Hirst presents something much closer to the reality of nature. Life and death unfold together, and each makes the other possible, like the prerequisite of each other. So leaving that room, I realized that Hirst had once again transformed a philosophical question into a physical experience. Philosophers have debated the relationship between life, change, and mortality for thousands of years. But Hirst never tries to answer those debates directly. Instead, he allows us to actually stand inside one. And watching the flies move throughout the installation, I was watching one of philosophy's oldest questions unfolding in real time. So that's why 1,000 years remained with me, and I'm sure a lot of people long after I left the museum. It allows this cycle of life to become the artwork. The final group of works I want to talk about isn't a single artwork, but a series that I think reveals Damien Hirst's philosophy more clearly than almost anything else he has created. Throughout the exhibition, I kept encountering medicine cabinets, shelves filled with pharmaceutical packaging, clinical glass display cases, and entire walls covered with neatly arranged pills. At first, they seemed completely different from the shark or 1,000 years. Those earlier works confronted me with death directly, whereas these appeared almost ordinary. They looked clean, organized, and strangely reassuring. But the longer I spent looking at them, the more I realized they were exploring the same philosophical question from a different direction. Hirst began making his medicine cabinet works in the late 1980s, not long after studying at Goldsmiths. One of the earliest examples, Sinner in 1988, was followed by numerous cabinets filled with carefully arranged medicines, surgical equipment, and medical supplies. In 1992, he expanded that idea with Pharmacy, an installation that recreated a whole chemist shop filled with thousands of medicines displayed in immaculate rows. So, walking through the exhibition, I was definitely struck by how familiar everything looked. Unlike the preserved shark or the severed cow's head, these were objects almost every visitor recognized. Most of us have opened a medicine cabinet at home. Most of us have visited a pharmacy, believing that whatever we needed to get better could be found somewhere behind those shelves. And this familiarity is exactly what gives the work its philosophical meaning and power. This is because medicine occupies a fascinating place in human history, because it represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. For thousands of years, diseases that once devastated whole populations gradually became treatable. The development of vaccines, for example, transformed public health, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries. Antibiotics, especially after Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin in 1928, really changed medicine during the 20th century. So countless lives have been saved because scientists refused to accept disease as inevitable. Looking at Hirst's medicine cabinets, I couldn't help admiring everything they represented, because all of these reminded me of human intelligence, curiosity, perseverance, and a lot more. They reflected centuries of scientific progress. At the same time, though, Hirst introduces a philosophical tension. Medicine has extended human life by a lot, relieved suffering, and cured illnesses that were once considered fatal once you get them. And that's amazing. But despite all of those achievements, it never removed mortality. Every medicine on those shelves exists because human beings are vulnerable. Every bottle represents an attempt to preserve life just a little bit longer. So that's why the cabinets felt so different after I'd already seen the shark. The shark confronts mortality openly. It's a shark. The medicine cabinets, though, reveal humanity's response to that same reality. So they both embody our determination to resist illness, postpone death as much as we can, and preserve the lives of the people we care about. What fascinated me most, though, was the order of these works. Every object occupies its own measured position, and the shelves appear almost mathematically perfect and precise, with colors, labels, and packaging arranged accordingly. So looking at them, I found myself thinking about our desire to create order in a world that often is unpredictable. Philosophy has always dealt with the tension between order and chaos. We develop scientific theories because we think nature can be understood at least to a certain extent. We build hospitals because we believe suffering can be reduced and we can genuinely make people feel better. We organize medicines into categories because knowledge and organization allows us to respond more effectively to illness. Hirst's cabinets seem to celebrate that same human achievement, but at the same time, it reminds us that order of any form has its limits. However carefully the medicines are arranged, they remain part of a world in which mortality has never disappeared. One of Hirst's most famous observations helped me understand these works even more. He once said, "I think I've got an obsession with death, but I think it's like a celebration of life rather than something morbid. You can't have one without the other." After seeing the exhibition, I understood this very differently. I think Hirst recognized that mortality gives significance to the time we have. If human life were endless, then many of the things we value most would lose part of their meaning. Urgency, gratitude, and even love are impacted by the knowledge that time is limited. The medicines, the preserved animals, all of the installations return to that same idea. So they encourage us to think about death because thinking honestly about mortality inevitably changes the way we think about living. So by the time I left the exhibition, I realized that Damien Hirst had completely changed the way I thought about contemporary art. I arrived expecting to see loads of provocative objects that challenged artistic tradition, but I left feeling more so as though I had spent several hours inside a philosophical argument. Every major work I encountered approached the same question through different things. The shark explored our inability to imagine our own death. 1,000 Years explored the cycle through which life and death remain inseparable and it feeds into the other. The medicine cabinets explored humanity's determination to understand, delay, and confront mortality through science. Although none of these works offered easy answers, I think that's exactly why they stayed with me and a lot more people as well. Great philosophy changes the questions we continue asking long after the conversation is already over. And for me, that's exactly what Damien Hirst's art accomplished.